Chapter 1. Salt and Forgetting. The first thing Thomas noticed wasn't the unfamiliar ceiling above his bed, nor the sound of waves crashing against distant cliffs. It was the smell. Salt and mildew, thick as fog, clinging to everything like wet wool. He sat up, blinking away the remnants of a dream where stone corridors had breathed and mirrors whispered his name, only to find himself in a dormitory that felt wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. The walls were painted institutional green, peeling at the corners where moisture had worked its patient fingers. 6 beds lined the room, each with identical gray blankets and a small wooden chest at the foot. Through tall, salt-stained windows, he could see the gray expanse of the North Sea stretching toward a horizon that seemed closer than it should be. Where am I? Thomas swung his legs over the side of the bed, his bare feet meeting cold linoleum that squelched slightly under his weight. The other beds were empty, sheets pulled tight with military precision. A nameplate on the wall read, 1 Dormitory 7 Saltmere Academy. Saltmere Academy. The name meant nothing to him, yet when he tried to remember how he'd arrived here, his thoughts scattered like startled birds. There had been another school, hadn't there? Something about mirrors, and a voice calling from beneath stone. But the harder he grasped for the memory, the more it dissolved, leaving only the taste of copper and the echo of his own name spoken in a voice that wasn't quite human. Thomas Blackwood. He spun toward the sound, heart hammering, but the dormitory remained empty. The voice had come from everywhere and nowhere, carried on the salt-thick air like the whisper of waves against rock. No, not again. He dressed quickly in the uniform that hung in the small wardrobe beside his bed. Navy blazer, gray trousers, white shirt that smelled faintly of seaweed. The clothes fit perfectly, as if they had been waiting for him. In the breast pocket of the blazer, he found a class schedule written in handwriting he didn't recognize, but that seemed familiar nonetheless. Thomas Blackwood, Year 11, Front Room 247, Latin, Mr. Caro, 9A Mem. Cell Room 189, History, Miss Dane, 10:30 Miss Sitter, and Library, Study Period, 12 p.m. And Room 134, Natural Sciences, Dr. Thorne, 2 p.m. The paper felt damp between his fingers, and when he held it up to the gray morning light, he could see watermarks that looked almost like words written in a language he'd never seen before. Thomas made his way out of the dormitory and into a corridor that stretched longer than the building should have allowed. The walls here were lined with dark wood paneling, scarred and water-damaged, and the floor was covered in a carpet so old its original color had faded to the gray-brown of dried kelp. Overhead, fluorescent lights flickered sporadically, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Other students passed him in the hallway, boys and girls in identical uniforms, their faces pale and expressionless. They moved with purpose but no urgency, as if they were sleepwalking through their routines. None of them looked at him, and when he tried to catch their eyes, they simply shifted their gaze away, as if he were a piece of furniture they had learned to navigate around. "Excuse me," he called to a girl with long brown hair tied back in a severe bun. She paused, turning toward him with movements that seemed too fluid, too practiced. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds, and when she looked at him, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. "Yes?" Her voice carried a slight accent, something northern, perhaps Scottish, but not quite right. "I'm new here," Thomas began, then stopped. The words felt wrong in his mouth, like a lie that had been rehearsed but never believed. I think I'm new. I can't remember arriving." The girl tilted her head, studying him with those unsettling gray eyes. "You're not new, Thomas. You've always been here. We all have." She paused, and for a moment something flickered across her features. Confusion, perhaps, or fear, but it was gone so quickly he might have imagined it. "You should get to class. Mr. Caro doesn't like tardiness." She turned and walked away before he could respond, her footsteps echoing in the corridor long after she disappeared around a corner. "You've always been here." The words followed him, as he made his way through the labyrinthine school, past classrooms where students sat in perfect rows, their hands folded, their eyes fixed on teachers who spoke in voices too low to understand. The building itself seemed to shift around him. Corridors that had been straight now curved. Doors that had been on his left were suddenly on his right, and everywhere, always, the smell of salt and decay. Room 247 was smaller than he'd expected, with desks arranged in a perfect circle around a raised platform where Mr. Caro stood with his back to the class. The teacher was tall and thin, his black hair slicked back with something that made it gleam like wet seaweed. When he finally turned around, Thomas saw that his eyes were completely black, not just the pupils, but the entirety of both eyes, as if they had been filled with ink. "Mr. Blackwood," Mr. Caro said, his voice carrying the same strange accent as the girl in the hallway. "How good of you to join us. Please, take your seat." Thomas looked around the room and realized that every desk was occupied except one, the one directly in front of the teacher's platform. The other students watched him as he walked to his seat, their expressions blank but somehow expectant, as if they were waiting for something to happen. As he sat down, he noticed that each desk had words carved into its surface, Latin phrases, he thought, though he couldn't read them. His own desk bore a single line of text, carved deep into the wood and stained dark with what looked like dried blood. Nunquam tange aquam quae cantat, but never touch water that sings. "Today," Mr. Caro announced, his black eyes fixing on Thomas with unsettling intensity, "we will be discussing the nature of memory, how it can be shaped, changed, erased entirely." He smiled, revealing teeth that were too white and too sharp. "Tell me, Mr. Blackwood, what do you remember of yesterday?" Thomas opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. Yesterday. When had yesterday been? He could remember waking up this morning, but before that, there was only fog, thick and gray and shot through with the sound of voices calling his name. He began, then stopped. The other students were leaning forward in their seats, and he could hear something else now, a soft sound like water moving through pipes. It seemed to be coming from beneath the floor, a gentle rushing that grew stronger as his confusion deepened. Mr. Caro's smile widened. "Memory is a river, Mr. Blackwood. Sometimes it runs clear, sometimes it runs muddy, and sometimes—" He paused, tilting his head as if listening to something only he could hear. "Sometimes it runs backward." The sound of water grew louder, and Thomas realized it wasn't coming from beneath the floor at all. It was coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from everywhere at once. And underneath it, barely audible, he could hear something else, a voice, singing in a language he didn't recognize but somehow understood. "Thomas, Thomas, come down to the water, Thomas." He gripped the edges of his desk, his knuckles white. The carved words seemed to pulse under his fingers, warm and wet, as if they had been freshly cut. "The first rule," Mr. Caro said, his voice barely audible over the sound of singing water, "is always the most important. It sets the foundation for everything that follows." His black eyes gleamed in the flickering fluorescent light. "Break it, and the others become inevitable." Thomas looked around the classroom, but the other students seemed oblivious to the sound that was now so loud it made his teeth ache. They sat motionless, their hands folded, their eyes fixed on some point beyond the windows where gray waves crashed against rocks that jutted from the sea like broken teeth. The singing grew stronger, more insistent, and Thomas found himself standing without conscious decision. His legs carried him toward the door, even as some rational part of his mind screamed at him to sit back down, to ignore the voice that was calling his name with such desperate longing. "Where are you going, Mr. Blackwood?" Mr. Caro's voice followed him, amused and somehow knowing. Thomas paused at the door, his hand on the handle. "I need to find the bathroom," he said, though the words felt like someone else's. "Of course you do." The teacher's laughter was soft and wet, like water bubbling up from a drain. "Follow the sound, Mr. Blackwood. It will take you exactly where you need to go." Chapter 2. The Girl with Wet Shoes. The hallway outside the classroom was empty, but the sound of singing water was stronger here. echoing off the walls and filling the air with a harmony that made Thomas's head spin. He followed it without conscious thought, his feet carrying him through corridors he didn't remember walking, past doorways that opened onto rooms filled with things that couldn't be there. A forest of pale trees growing from a tile floor, a swimming pool where dark shapes moved beneath the surface, a library where the books bled ink that pooled on the floor like spilled wine. This isn't real. This can't be real. But the singing was real. It pulled at something deep inside him, something that recognized the melody even though he'd never heard it before. It was beautiful and terrible and utterly compelling, and with each step he took toward its source, he felt pieces of himself slipping away. Memories, thoughts, even his own name seemed to become less solid, less certain. The singing led him to a stairwell he hadn't noticed before, tucked behind a door marked authorized personnel only in faded red letters. The stairs descended into darkness, the walls slick with moisture that caught the weak light from above and threw it back in rippling patterns. The sound was stronger here, echoing up from the depths like the voice of something vast and patient and hungry. Thomas gripped the handrail and began to descend, his footsteps ringing against the metal steps. The air grew colder as he went down, and he could taste salt on his lips, thick and briny like seawater. Somewhere in the darkness below, water dripped steadily, a counterpoint to the haunting melody that drew him ever deeper. He had descended perhaps 20 steps when he saw her. She stood on a landing halfway down, her back to him, wearing a school uniform that was soaked through. Water dripped from her hair, from her clothes, from her fingers, forming puddles on the concrete floor that reflected the weak light from above. Her shoes squelched with each breath she took, as if they were filled with seawater. "You shouldn't be here," she said without turning around. Her voice was young, a girl about his own age, but there was something ancient in it, something that spoke of depths and darkness, and things that had been forgotten for very good reasons. "I heard the singing," Thomas replied, surprised by how steady his own voice sounded. "I had to follow it." The girl turned then, and Thomas saw that she was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are. Pale skin that seemed to glow. In the dim light, dark hair that clung to her face in wet strands. Eyes that were the deep blue-green of ocean depths. But there was something wrong with her face, something that made his mind recoil even as his eyes couldn't look away. It took him a moment to realize what it was. She had no reflection in the puddles at her feet. "The singing isn't for you," she said, stepping closer. Her wet shoes left prints on the concrete that steamed slightly, as if the water was warmer than the air. "Not yet. You're not ready." "Ready for what?" She smiled, and Thomas saw that her teeth were stained green, like seaweed. "To go home, of course. To remember who you really are." She gestured toward the darkness below. "But first you have to finish what you started. The rules are breaking down, Thomas. The barriers are weakening. Soon there won't be anything left to hold it back." "Hold what back?" But the girl was already fading, becoming translucent, her form wavering like heat shimmer. "Don't finish the staircase," she whispered, her voice growing distant. "No matter what you hear down there, no matter what calls your name, don't finish the staircase." And then she was gone, leaving only wet footprints and the lingering smell of brine. Thomas stood alone on the landing, his heart pounding. The singing had stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums. He looked up toward the door he'd entered through, then down into the darkness that stretched below. Every rational instinct told him to turn around, to go back to the classroom, to pretend none of this was happening. Instead, he began to descend. The stairs continued down much farther than they should have, given the size of the building above. Thomas counted steps at first, 50, then 100, then 200, before giving up. The walls here were different, older, made of stone blocks that wept moisture, and were covered in a green slime that pulsed faintly with its own light. The air was thick and humid, like breathing underwater, and each step echoed strangely, as if the sound was being absorbed and transformed by something vast and listening. At step 313, Thomas found the second rule. It was carved into the wall at eye level, the letters deep and precise and filled with the same dark stain he'd seen on his desk. Noli loqui puella calciamentis matidis. Don't speak to the girl with wet shoes. Too late for that, he thought, and immediately felt something shift in the air around him. A subtle change in pressure, as if the building itself had inhaled. Somewhere in the darkness below, he heard the sound of water beginning to move again, not singing this time but rushing, as if a dam had been opened. He continued down. The staircase began to curve now, spiraling deeper into the earth than should have been possible. The stone walls were covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, geometric patterns that seemed to writhe and shift when he wasn't focusing on them, letters from alphabets that had never been meant for human eyes. Some of them were carved into the stone, others painted in substances he didn't want to identify, and a few seemed to be made of the green slime itself, pulsing with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. At step 497, Thomas realized he was no longer alone. Something was following him down the stairs. He could hear its footsteps echoing above, perfectly synchronized with his own. When he stopped, it stopped. When he started again, it resumed its descent. But whenever he looked back, the staircase stretched empty into the darkness above. Don't look back, he told himself. Just keep going down. But the presence behind him grew stronger with each step, until he could feel its breath on the back of his neck, cold and damp and smelling of deep water and decay. His shadow, cast by the faint phosphorescence of the slime, began to behave strangely, sometimes falling behind his movements, sometimes moving ahead of them, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. At step 601, Thomas found his locker. It shouldn't have been there, embedded in the stone wall like it had grown from the rock itself. The metal was green with corrosion, and seawater leaked from the seams to pool on the steps below. His name was stenciled on the front in letters that seemed to shift and change as he watched. Thomas Blackwood, then Thomas Blackthorne, then names in languages he didn't recognize before settling back to the original. The combination lock was already open. Thomas pulled the door wide, and more seawater cascaded out, carrying with it the smell of deep ocean and something else, something organic and decaying. Inside the locker, instead of books or clothes, he found words scratched into the metal with what looked like fingernails. Ring around the rosy. Pocket full of posies. Ashes, ashes. Them all fall down. But underneath, carved deeper and stained with rust that might have been blood, was the same rhyme written backward. Wad la fla u. Chisisissa. Sesop fo luf tek kop. Chazor et dura near. Thomas stared at the reversed words, and as he did, they seemed to rearrange themselves in his mind, taking on meaning that had nothing to do with their original form. It wasn't a nursery rhyme at all. It was directions, instructions, a map leading somewhere he didn't want to go but knew he would follow anyway. And to staircase down does not end, do not finish it. The girl's warning echoed in his memory, but it was too late now. He could feel the pull of the depths below, stronger than ever, and the presence behind him had grown so close he could hear it breathing. When he looked down at the pooled seawater at his feet, he saw not his own reflection but the face of someone else, someone who looked like him but whose eyes held depths that spoke of years spent in darkness. The reflection smiled and mouthed a single word, "Come." Thomas closed the locker and continued down the stairs, leaving wet footprints that steamed in the cold air. Behind him, his shadow followed, but it was no longer his shadow at all. It was longer, thinner, and sometimes it had too many arms. Chapter 3. The Rhyme Reversed. At step 733, the staircase ended. Thomas found himself standing before a heavy wooden door, its surface carved with the same symbols that covered the walls, but older, deeper, worn smooth by countless hands. There was no handle, no lock, only a small brass plate set at eye level, with words etched in a script that seemed to crawl across the metal. Tertia regula, scala diorsum non terminator. And the third rule, the staircase down does not end. But it had ended. He was standing at the bottom, facing a door that shouldn't exist in a place that couldn't be real. Thomas pressed his ear to the wood and heard nothing. Not the singing, not the sound of rushing water, not even his own heartbeat. The silence was complete and absolute, as if the door opened onto a void where sound itself couldn't survive. He pushed it open. The room beyond was vast, its ceiling lost in shadows that pressed down like a living thing. The walls were lined with pipes, copper and iron and materials he couldn't identify, some as thin as his finger, others large enough for a person to crawl through. They ran in every direction, disappearing into the darkness above and below, and from somewhere within their depths came a sound like breathing, slow and rhythmic and patient. In the center of the room stood a circular pool, its surface black as obsidian and perfectly still. Around its edge, someone had carved the reversed nursery rhyme in letters that glowed with their own pale light. Mwad, laf u. Chisisisa, sesop fo luf tek kop. Chazor eight duura near. Thomas approached the pool slowly, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. The surface of the water was so dark it seemed solid, like polished stone. But as he drew closer, he could see shapes moving beneath. Pale forms that might have been fish or might have been something else entirely. "The rhyme is a key," said a voice behind him. Thomas spun around, but the room was empty. The voice had come from everywhere and nowhere, carried on air that tasted of salt and copper. "Speak it aloud," the voice continued, and Thomas realized it was coming from the pipes themselves, a whisper that traveled through the network of metal and emerged from a dozen different openings at once. "Speak it aloud, and see what you have forgotten." Thomas looked down at the glowing words carved around the pool's edge. He knew he shouldn't speak them. The girl with wet shoes had warned him, and some deep instinct screamed danger. But the compulsion was overwhelming. The words seemed to pull at his tongue, begging to be spoken, promising answers to questions he didn't even know he was asking. "Ring around the rosy," he whispered. The surface of the pool rippled, and the shapes beneath began to move faster, pressing against the underside of the water like trapped insects against glass. Pocket full of posies. Something knocked against the pipes, a sharp metallic sound that echoed through the room. The breathing in the walls grew faster, more urgent. Ashes, ashes. The water in the pool began to glow with the same pale light as the carved words, and Thomas could see clearly now what moved beneath the surface. They were children, dozens of them, floating just below the waterline with their eyes closed and their mouths open in silent screams. They wore school uniforms like his own, but the fabric was rotted and stained, and seaweed clung to their hair like crowns. "We all fall down." The words left his mouth before he could stop them, and immediately the room changed. The pipes began to sing, a harmony that was beautiful and terrible and utterly alien. The pool's surface broke as pale hands reached up from the depths, grasping at air that had suddenly become thick as honey. And somewhere in the network of breathing walls, Thomas heard his own voice calling out in response. But the voice was coming from below, not from his throat. "Help me," the other Thomas whispered from somewhere in the pipes. "Please, help me. I've been here so long, so very long." Thomas stumbled backward from the pool, his heart hammering against his ribs. The pale hands had broken the surface now, followed by arms and shoulders and faces that were his own face reflected back at him from different angles, different times. Some looked younger, some older, all of them trapped beneath water that sang with voices of the damned. "The fourth rule," said the voice from the pipes, and Thomas realized it wasn't his voice at all. It was the voice of something that had learned to mimic him, something that had been practicing for years. "Never repeat the rhyme aloud. But you've already broken that one, haven't you, Thomas? Just like you broke the others." The room was changing around him, the walls stretching higher, the pool growing wider. Thomas could see now that the pipes didn't just line the walls. They formed a vast network that extended in every direction, connecting this chamber to others, creating a circulatory system for something massive and alive. And through it all flowed water that sang and whispered and called his name in voices he almost recognized. "Where am I?" he asked the darkness. "You're home," came the reply from a dozen different pipes at once. You've always been home, Thomas. Every school, every building, every place you've ever woken up, they're all the same place, seen from different angles, different rules, different restrictions, but the same foundation underneath, the same hungry darkness waiting to be fed. Thomas ran. He burst through the wooden door and took the stairs 3 at a time, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind him, he could hear the sound of water rising, flooding the chamber he'd just left, and underneath it, the voice that wore his face pleading with him to come back, to not leave it alone in the dark. But the staircase wasn't the same as it had been. The steps were wrong now, some too high, some too low, some missing entirely. The walls pressed closer together, forcing him to squeeze through gaps that shouldn't have been there, and the symbols carved into the stone pulsed with angry red light. At what should have been step 500, he found the 4th rule carved into a section of wall that was weeping blood instead of water. Chernoli Carmen alta voce iterari said, "Never repeat the rhyme aloud." Too late, Thomas thought, and pressed on. The presence that had followed him down was waiting for him now, standing on the stairs above. In the pulsing red light from the walls, Thomas could see it clearly for the first time. It was him, but wrong, twisted, as if someone had tried to recreate his appearance from a description given by someone who had never actually seen him. Its eyes were black holes in a face that was almost his own, and when it smiled, Thomas saw that its mouth was full of seawater that trickled down its chin like saliva. "You can't leave," it said in his voice. "You broke the rules. You called them up from the deep places, and now they know you're here. They remember you, Thomas. They remember what you did." "What did I do?" Thomas pressed himself against the wall, trying to squeeze past the thing that wore his face. "I don't remember anything." "You will," it promised, reaching for him with fingers that were too long and had too many joints. "When you reach the top, when you go back to that classroom and sit in that chair and pretend to be just another student, you'll remember everything then, and you'll wish you had stayed down here with me." Thomas ducked under its grasping arms and ran, taking the stairs 4 at a time now, his legs burning with the effort. The presence followed, its footsteps perfectly synchronized with his own, and no matter how fast he climbed, it never fell behind. The stairs seemed to go on forever, rising through darkness that pressed against him like a physical weight. The walls here were different again, older, made of stone that looked almost organic, covered in a slime that pulsed with the rhythm of a massive heartbeat, and carved into every surface, repeated over and over in languages both familiar and alien, were the 7 rules that governed this place. Never touch water that sings. Don't speak to the girl with wet shoes. And now the staircase down does not end. Do not finish it. Never repeat the rhyme aloud. And do not blink near the basement mirror. Don't answer if the pipes knock. The chamber is not a place. It's a mouth. Thomas had already broken 4 of them. As he climbed, he began to remember things, fragments at first, then larger pieces, like a jigsaw puzzle reassembling itself in his mind. He remembered other schools, other dormitories, other sets of rules that he had inevitably broken. He remembered waking up in unfamiliar places with no memory of how he'd arrived, always with the feeling that he was being watched, always with the sound of water singing somewhere just beyond his hearing. And he remembered the voice that called to him from below, always asking him to come down, always promising answers if he would just descend one more step, open one more door, break one more rule. How many times have I done this? He wondered. How many schools have there been? The answer came not in words but in images, a cascade of dormitories and classrooms and corridors that stretched back through years he couldn't count. Different buildings, different faces, but always the same underlying structure, the same network of pipes and chambers and hungry darkness waiting beneath. At what might have been step 100 or step 1000, Thomas found the door he had entered through. It stood open, revealing the hallway beyond where students moved through their routines with clockwork precision. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting the same dancing shadows, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the sound of a teacher's voice droning through a lesson that would never end. Thomas stepped through the door and into the hallway, his legs shaking with exhaustion. Behind him, the presence that wore his face lingered in the stairwell, watching him with those black hole eyes. "This isn't over," it said, its voice barely a whisper. "You can't run from what you are forever, Thomas. Sooner or later you'll have to face the truth." The door swung shut with a sound like a coffin lid closing, leaving Thomas alone in the hallway. But he could still hear the voice, muffled now but persistent, speaking words that made his skin crawl. "The chamber is not a place, it's a mouth. And it's hungry, Thomas, so very, very hungry." Chapter 4, What the Pipes Remember. Thomas made it back to the Latin classroom just as the bell rang, slipping into his seat while the other students filed out in their eerily synchronized procession. Mr. Carroll watched him from behind his desk, those impossible black eyes reflecting nothing. "Did you find what you were looking for, Mr. Blackwood?" the teacher asked, his voice carrying that same wet quality Thomas had noticed before, as if he were speaking through water. "I found the bathroom," Thomas lied, his hands trembling as he gathered his books. The carved words on his desk seemed deeper now, the dark stain more pronounced. "Never touch water that sings." Mr. Carroll smiled, revealing those two sharp teeth. "Of course you did, and I trust you washed your hands thoroughly. One must always be careful about what one touches in the deeper parts of the building." Thomas fled the classroom without responding, but he could feel the teacher's laughter following him into the hallway, a sound like water bubbling up from a blocked drain. The next period was history with Miss Dane, but when Thomas arrived at room 189, he found only an empty classroom with desks arranged in perfect rows. He waited for 10 minutes before a student he didn't recognize poked her head through the doorway. "Miss Dane isn't coming back," the girl said matter-of-factly. Her uniform was identical to his own, but something about her seemed different, more solid, more real than the other students he'd encountered. "She went to check the basement pipes yesterday and never came back up." "What do you mean, never came back up?" The girl shrugged, but Thomas caught a flicker of something in her eyes, fear quickly suppressed. "People disappear sometimes. The teachers don't talk about it, and after a while we stop remembering they were ever here." She paused, studying his face. "You look like you've seen something you shouldn't have." Thomas almost told her about the staircase, about the chamber with its pool of floating children, about the thing that wore his face and spoke with his voice. But something held him back, a warning that felt like it came from the carved words themselves. "I'm fine," he said instead. The girl nodded, but she didn't look convinced. "My name's Sarah," she said, "Sarah Chen. I've been here longer than most." She glanced around the empty classroom, then leaned closer. "Can I give you some advice?" Thomas nodded. "Don't go looking for the missing students. Don't ask questions about the basement. And whatever you do, don't listen to the pipes when they start knocking." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "They remember things we're supposed to forget." Before Thomas could respond, she was gone, leaving him alone in the empty classroom with only the sound of his own heartbeat and the distant crash of waves against the cliffs below. Thomas spent his study period in the library, a vast room lined with books that seemed to stretch impossibly high. The volumes were old and water-damaged, their pages swollen with moisture and their spines faded beyond recognition. But when he pulled one from the shelf at random, the text inside was perfectly legible and deeply disturbing. It was titled A History of Saltmere Academy and written in the same spidery handwriting he'd seen on his class schedule. According to the book, the school had been built in 1847 on the site of a much older structure, a monastery that had been abandoned after a series of unexplained disappearances. The monks, the text claimed, had been attempting to map the extensive cave system beneath the coastal cliffs when they discovered something that defied all natural understanding. And the brothers reported hearing voices from the deep places, the book continued, and singing in harmonies that no human throat could produce. Brother Matthias described them as the voices of those who fell before the world learned to forget. Several expeditions were mounted to investigate the source of these sounds, but none returned. The monastery was sealed by order of the church in 1671. Thomas flipped through more pages, finding references to the construction of the current building and its early years as a school for gifted children. But the gift, it seemed, was not academic. It was the ability to hear the singing water, to see through the barriers that kept most people safely ignorant of what lay beneath. And to students who demonstrate the strongest sensitivity to the phenomenon, one passage read, "He'd often exhibit signs of rapid psychological deterioration. They report vivid dreams of drowning, claim to see reflections that do not match their movements, and frequently attempt to reach the lower levels of the building. Such students require careful monitoring and, when necessary, permanent relocation to ensure the safety of the general population." Permanent relocation. Thomas thought of Miss Dane, who had gone to check the pipes and never returned. He thought of the floating children in the pool below, their mouths open in silent screams. He was about to close the book when he noticed something strange about the final page. Instead of printed text, it contained a handwritten message in ink that looked suspiciously dark. "Thomas, if you are reading this, it means you have begun to remember. The girl with wet shoes tried to warn you, but warnings are useless against hunger. You will break all 7 rules because you have no choice. You broke them before, and you will break them again. Look for the mirror in the basement. But remember, do not blink. P.T. The initials were his own. Thomas slammed the book shut and shoved it back onto the shelf, his hands shaking. But when he turned around, he found Sarah Chen standing behind him, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "You found one of the memory books," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can tell by the look on your face. They appear sometimes, written by students who came before. Students who—" She trailed off, glancing around the empty library. Students who what? Students who remembered too much. Sarah moved closer, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet. "The building doesn't like to be remembered, Thomas. It prefers us to forget, to accept each day as if it's the first. But some people can't forget. They keep digging, keep asking questions until they find answers they wish they hadn't." Thomas thought of the message in the book, written in his own handwriting. "How long have I been here, Sarah?" Her expression grew even more frightened. "I don't know. Time doesn't work the same way here. Sometimes I feel like I've been here for weeks, sometimes for years. But you—" She studied his face carefully. "You feel older, like you've been carrying memories for a very long time." Before Thomas could respond, the sound began, a rhythmic knocking that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. Sarah's face went white. "The pipes," she breathed. "They're knocking. Knock, knock, knock." The sound was slow and deliberate, like someone tapping out a message. Thomas found himself counting the intervals without conscious thought. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. "SOS," he said aloud, and immediately regretted it. Sarah grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his flesh. "Don't answer them. That's the 6th rule. Don't answer if the pipes knock. They're trying to get you to respond, to acknowledge them." But the knocking continued, growing louder and more insistent. It wasn't coming from just one location now. The sound seemed to move through the walls, traveling from pipe to pipe in a complex pattern that hurt to follow. And underneath it, barely audible, Thomas could hear something else. Voices, calling his name in harmonies that made his skin crawl. "Thomas. Thomas. Answer us. Thomas." "We need to leave," Sarah said, pulling him toward the library entrance. When the pipes start knocking, it means they're trying to break through. The barriers between levels get weaker, and things start to bleed through. They made it to the hallway just as the lights began to flicker. The fluorescent tubes overhead buzzed and sparked, casting crazy shadows that danced across the walls. Other students moved through the corridors, but they seemed oblivious to the knocking that now filled the entire building, a rhythmic pounding that made the floor vibrate under their feet. "How can they not hear it?" Thomas asked. "They do hear it," Sarah replied, leading him toward a staircase that led up rather than down. "But they've learned not to listen. The building teaches you to ignore things that don't fit, to accept contradictions as normal. Most students adapt within a few weeks. But not all of them? No, not all. She paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking back at him with eyes that held depths he hadn't noticed before. Some of us remember, some of us fight back, and some of us— she gestured toward the knocking pipes. Some of us become part of the building itself. They climbed to the second floor, the knocking growing fainter but never quite disappearing. The hallway here was different, older, with wood paneling that was warped and water-damaged. Portraits lined the walls showing stern-faced men and women in Victorian dress, but when Thomas looked closely, he noticed that all the faces were wrong somehow. Features slightly off-center, eyes that didn't quite track together, smiles that revealed too many teeth. Former headmasters, Sarah explained, noticing his attention. Or at least, that's what the plaques say. But I've seen some of these faces before, down in the lower levels. I think they're still here, in one form or another. They stopped at a door marked Natural Sciences. Dr. Thorne and Sarah pulled out a set of keys that shouldn't have existed. The locks in this place were supposed to be electronic, controlled by magnetic cards. "Where did you get those?" Thomas asked. "I made them," she said simply, unlocking the door. "When you've been here long enough, you learn to work around the rules. The building expects certain behaviors, certain limitations. When you break those expectations—" She pushed the door open, revealing a classroom that was definitely not equipped for natural sciences. The room was circular, with no windows and no desks. The walls were covered in symbols similar to those Thomas had seen in the stairwell, but these were different, newer, carved with more precision. They seemed to pulse with their own light, creating patterns that shifted and changed as he watched. And in the center of the room, set into the floor like a drain, was a metal grate that breathed. "This is where Dr. Thorne used to teach," Sarah said, closing the door behind them, "before he went exploring and found something he shouldn't have. The building recycled his classroom, but it couldn't quite erase what he learned. Some knowledge is too dangerous to simply forget." Thomas approached the grate in the floor, drawn by the sound of air moving through metal. The breathing was slow and regular, like something massive sleeping just below. Through the gaps in the metal he could see water moving, the same dark water from the pool below, flowing through channels that connected to the greater network. "What is this place, really?" he asked. Sarah moved to stand beside him, her reflection wavering in the dark water below the grate. "I think it's alive," she said quietly. "The whole building, the whole complex. It's not just a school. It's something that feeds on memory, on identity. It lures certain people here, people who can see through the barriers, and then it slowly absorbs them. But why? What does it want? To grow, to spread. Every person it absorbs becomes part of its network, another voice in the pipes, another set of memories to draw from." She looked at him with eyes that held terrible knowledge. "I think it's been doing this for a very long time, Thomas. Centuries, maybe millennia. The monastery, the school, they're just the most recent incarnations." The breathing from the grate grew stronger, and Thomas could hear something else now. Voices, speaking in unison, reciting words in that same reversed language he'd seen in his locker. "Wad, la fla, u. Chisisissa, sesop fo luf tek kop. Chazor eight dura near." "They're calling the rhyme," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. "It's starting again. The cycle." "What cycle?" But she was already moving toward the door, her keys jangling in her trembling hands. "We need to get to the basement. There's something I need to show you, something Dr. Thorne discovered before he disappeared." She paused, looking back at him with an expression of desperate hope. "I think there might be a way to stop this, Thomas, but you'll have to break the fifth rule to do it." Thomas thought of the message in the book, written in his own handwriting. "A look for the mirror in the basement. But remember, do not blink." "The mirror," he said. Sarah nodded grimly. "The mirror. It's not like the others. It doesn't just show reflections, it shows truth. And sometimes if you're very careful and very brave, you can use that truth to fight back." The voices from below grew louder, more insistent, and Thomas could feel the building responding. Walls shifting slightly, floors tilting at angles that shouldn't be possible, reality bending to accommodate something vast and hungry stirring in the depths. "Let's go," he said. Chapter 5. The Basement Mirror. The basement of Saltmere Academy wasn't supposed to exist. According to the official building plans that Sarah had somehow acquired, the structure had only 2 floors above ground level, with a small utility room below for heating and electrical systems. But the stairs she led Thomas down descended much farther than that, passing through layers of architecture that told the story of the building's true history. First came the modern construction, concrete and steel from the 1960s renovation, sterile and institutional. Then older stone blocks, probably from the original school building in the 1840s. Below that, medieval masonry that must have belonged to the monastery. And finally, at the deepest level, something that predated human construction entirely, walls that looked grown rather than built, surfaces that curved and flowed like the interior of some vast organism. The building goes down much farther than it goes up, Sarah explained as they descended, her voice echoing strangely in the narrow stairwell. "I've been mapping it for months, trying to understand the layout. The basement we're going to is only the first level. Below that, there are chambers and tunnels that stretch for miles underground. How do you know all this?" "Because I've been there." Her voice was quiet, matter of fact. "Before I learned better, before I understood the rules, I went exploring, just like Dr. Thorne, just like Miss Dane, just like dozens of others. The difference is, I found my way back." Thomas wanted to ask more, but they had reached the bottom of the stairs, where a heavy metal door marked authorized personnel only stood slightly ajar. Beyond it he could hear the sound of water moving through pipes and something else, a rhythmic thumping that might have been machinery or might have been a heartbeat. Sarah pushed the door open, revealing a room that defied the laws of physics. It was enormous, easily the size of a cathedral, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadows above. But this was impossible. They were directly beneath the school building, which was nowhere near large enough to contain such a space. The walls were lined with pipes of every conceivable size and material, from thin copper tubes to massive concrete conduits wide enough to walk through. Water flowed through all of them, creating a symphony of sound that ranged from gentle trickling to thunderous rushing. And in the center of the room, mounted on a simple wooden stand, was a mirror. It was old, Victorian perhaps, with an ornate silver frame that was tarnished black with age. But unlike every other reflective surface Thomas had encountered in this place, it showed no reflection at all. Instead, its surface rippled like water, dark and deep and utterly opaque. "That's it," Sarah whispered. "Dr. Thorne's mirror. He found it in one of the lower chambers and brought it up here. According to his notes, it doesn't reflect light. It reflects truth." Thomas approached the mirror slowly, acutely aware that he was about to break the 5th rule, and do not blink near the basement mirror. But he had to see, had to understand what was happening to him, what had been happening for longer than he wanted to contemplate. "What did Dr. Thorne see in it?" he asked. "Everything." Sarah's voice was barely audible over the sound of flowing water. "The real history of this place, the thing that lives in the deep chambers, the network of schools and buildings and institutions it's created over the centuries to feed itself." She paused, then added quietly, "And what we really are." Thomas stood directly in front of the mirror now, close enough to touch its rippling surface. He could feel something radiating from it, not heat or cold, but a kind of pressure that made his teeth ache and his vision blur around the edges. "Remember," Sarah called from behind him, "don't blink. No matter what you see, don't blink." Thomas stared into the mirror's dark surface, forcing his eyes to remain open even as they began to water. At first he saw nothing but blackness, deep and impenetrable. Then, slowly, images began to form. He saw himself as a child, younger than he remembered being, standing in a different dormitory in a different school. But it wasn't different. It was the same place, seen from a different angle, filtered through different rules. The boy in the mirror moved through corridors that were simultaneously familiar and alien, breaking rules that were identical in purpose if not in form. Never look in mirrors after midnight. Don't enter the East Wing alone. And the voice in the walls is not human. Different words, same warnings. Different building, same hungry darkness below. The image shifted, showing him older, in another school, another set of rules. Then older still, in a place that looked like a hospital, where the forbidden rules were disguised as medical protocols. Patients must not access the sub-basement, but not respond to voices from the ventilation system, and report all unusual dreams to staff immediately. Thomas watched himself break these rules too, drawn always downward, always deeper, until he found the chamber with its pool of floating bodies and its network of singing pipes. And each time, he was caught, absorbed, added to the collection of voices that called from below, but he was also released, sent back up, memory wiped, to begin again in a new location with a new set of rules to break. The cycle repeated endlessly, each iteration adding to the thing's knowledge, its understanding of how to manipulate and control. How many times, Thomas wondered, staring at the cascade of images in the mirror. How many schools, how many lives, how many versions of myself? The answer came not in words but in sensation, a crushing weight of repetition, of centuries spent in service to something vast and patient and utterly alien. He had been here since the beginning, since the monastery, since before that. He was the first, the prototype, the template from which all other victims were measured. And he was not alone. The mirror's surface rippled, showing him other faces, students and teachers and staff members, all caught in the same endless cycle, all feeding the hunger of the thing below. But some of them had found ways to fight back, to retain fragments of memory between iterations, to work against their captor even as they served it. Sarah appeared in the mirror, but she was different, older, her hair longer, her face marked with lines of exhaustion and determination. She was in a laboratory somewhere, working with equipment Thomas didn't recognize, taking notes in the same spidery handwriting he'd seen in the library book. She's been trying to find a way out, he realized. For how long? The image in the mirror shifted again, showing him the laboratory where Sarah worked. It was real, he understood, not a memory or a vision, but something happening right now, in another part of the building's impossible architecture. And on the table before her lay something that made his heart race with equal parts hope and terror. It was a map, not of the building's physical layout, but of the network itself, lines and nodes and connection points that showed how the various institutions were linked, how the thing spread its influence, how it maintained control over its victims. And marked on the map, in red ink that looked suspiciously like blood, were the weak points, places where the network could be disrupted, where a coordinated effort might be able to cause real damage. Enemy mirrors, Thomas realized, reading the notes scattered around the map. Enemy mirrors are connection points. Break enough of them, and the network starts to collapse. But as he watched, something else moved in the laboratory. A shadow that detached itself from the walls, flowing across the floor like spilled ink. Sarah looked up from her work, her face going white with terror, and Thomas saw her mouth form a single word. A run. The mirror's surface went black. Thomas stumbled backward, his eyes streaming from the effort of not blinking. Sarah caught his arm, her face tight with worry. "What did you see?" she asked. "You," he gasped. "In a laboratory. There was a map, and something was coming for you, and—" "The laboratory." Sarah's face went even paler. "That's where I've been working, in the deep levels. But if you saw it in the mirror, that means it's happening now, real time." She looked toward the pipes that lined the walls, and Thomas could hear it too, the sound of something moving through the network, flowing toward its target with predatory purpose. "We have to help her," Thomas said. "Help who?" Thomas looked at her in confusion. "Help you, the you in the laboratory." Sarah shook her head slowly. "Thomas, I'm right here. I'm with you. What you saw in the mirror." She trailed off, understanding dawning in her eyes. Oh no. What? Time doesn't work the same way here. The mirror doesn't just show truth. It shows all truth, from all times, past, present, future, alternate possibilities. She gripped his arm tighter. "The me you saw in the laboratory. That might be a future version, or a past one, or a version from a different iteration of the cycle. Thomas thought of the message in the library book, written in his own handwriting. How many versions of himself had walked these halls, broken these rules, tried to find a way out? But the map, he said, the weak points in the network, if we could find it, then we might have a chance. Sarah was already moving toward a different section of the basement, where the pipes clustered more thickly and the sound of flowing water was almost overwhelming. Dr. Thorne's laboratory is deeper down, in the older sections. If there are answers to be found, that's where they'll be. As they walked between the massive pipes, Thomas became aware that the water wasn't just flowing, it was carrying voices. Whispers and sobs and pleas for help, all mixed together in a chorus of despair. Some of the voices he recognized as his own, calling out from different times, different iterations of the endless cycle. Help me. I don't want to forget again. Please, someone remember. The chamber is not a place. It's a mouth. That last voice was stronger than the others, more recent. Thomas realized it was coming from the most recent version of himself, the one who had descended the spiral staircase and found the pool of floating children. That Thomas was still down there, still trapped in the chamber, still adding his voice to the network that powered this place. Every version of us that gets caught becomes part of the system, Sarah explained, noticing his attention to the voices. But sometimes fragments break free, retain independence. That's how I've been able to work against it. I'm not the first Sarah to try this, and probably not the last. They reached a section of wall where the pipes formed a complex intersection, dozens of conduits joining and separating in patterns that hurt to look at directly. And there, partially hidden behind the largest pipe, was another door. This one was older than the others, made of wood that had been stained black by moisture and time. Symbols were carved into its surface, not the angular script Thomas had seen elsewhere, but something more organic, more alive. The symbols seemed to writhe and shift as he watched, forming words and languages that had never been meant for human tongues. Dr. Thorne's laboratory, Sarah said, producing her impossible keys. Whatever answers exist, they're behind this door. She unlocked it and pushed it open, revealing a space that defied rational explanation. The laboratory was enormous, filled with equipment that ranged from recognizably modern to utterly alien. Tables covered with maps and charts and notebooks filled with cramped handwriting, specimens floating in jars of murky liquid, and everywhere, mirrors, dozens of them, of every size and shape, some showing reflections, others rippling like water, a few that seemed to contain entire landscapes. And at the far end of the room, hunched over a desk covered with papers, was Dr. Thorne himself. He looked up as they entered, and Thomas saw that his eyes had been replaced by mirrors, small perfect circles that reflected not their surroundings but something else entirely. When he spoke, his voice carried the echo of deep water. "Sarah," he said, and his mirrored eyes fixed on Thomas, and the wanderer returns. "How many times now, Thomas? How many iterations of this same conversation?" Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You remember me?" "I remember everything." Dr. Thorne gestured to the mirrors around the room. "That's the price of knowledge in this place. Perfect memory, perfect understanding, and the perfect inability to act on either." He smiled, revealing teeth that were stained green with algae. "I've been expecting you. Both of you. We have work to do." Chapter 6. The Network's Heart. Dr. Thorne's laboratory existed in a state of controlled chaos. Maps covered every available surface, marked with symbols and notations in multiple languages, connected by strings of different colors that formed a web of bewildering complexity. The mirrors reflected not the room around them but other locations, other schools, other institutions, other nodes in the vast network that stretched across continents and centuries. "How long have you been down here?" Sarah asked, staring at the doctor's transformed features. His mirrored eyes caught the light from various sources and threw it back in patterns that made Thomas's head ache. "Time is relative in the deep places," Dr. Thorne replied, shuffling through papers on his desk with movements that were too fluid, too inhuman. I've been here for days or years, or perhaps I haven't arrived yet. The network operates outside normal temporal constraints. Thomas approached one of the larger maps, recognizing the layout of Saltmere Academy in the center, with lines radiating outward to dozens of other locations. Some he recognized from half-remembered dreams: Eildar Hollow, the previous school with its forbidden east wing and whispering mirrors. Others were completely alien: hospitals with impossible geometries, office buildings that existed in the spaces between seconds, residential homes where families forgot each other's names. "This is all connected," Thomas said, tracing the lines with his finger. "Every place I've been, every school, every institution, they're all part of the same system." "Feeding stations," Dr. Thorne confirmed. "The entity, I call it the collective, for lack of a better term, requires a constant supply of human consciousness to maintain itself. But it's selective. Only certain individuals possess the sensitivity necessary to perceive the deeper reality. You, Thomas, are particularly valuable." "Why me?" Dr. Thorne's mirror eyes focused on him with unsettling intensity. "Because you're the first, the original template. Every other sensitive individual it encounters is measured against your psychic signature. You're the proof of concept, the beta test that's been running for centuries." Thomas felt the weight of that revelation settle on him like a lead blanket. "How many centuries?" "The monastery was abandoned in 1671, Dr. Thorne said, consulting one of his notebooks, "but the caves beneath it were occupied long before that. I've found references going back to Roman times, soldiers who reported hearing singing from underground, entire cohorts that vanished while exploring the coastal caves." Sarah moved to a table covered with what looked like technical diagrams, circuit patterns, but organic, as if someone had tried to map the nervous system of some vast creature. "These are the connection points," she said. "The mirrors, the pools, the pipes, they're all part of a single organism. Not an organism in any sense we would understand," Dr. Thorne corrected. "Something between a living creature and a distributed intelligence. It exists primarily as information, as patterns of thought and memory, but it requires physical anchor points to maintain coherence." Thomas studied the diagrams, noting the symbols that marked critical junctions in the network. The rules, he realized, they're not arbitrary. They're warnings about the connection points. Precisely. Each rule is designed to keep the uninitiated away from the network's most vulnerable nodes. But for individuals like yourself, the rules become compulsions. The more you're warned away from something, the more irresistibly you're drawn to it. Dr. Thorne moved to a bank of mirrors along one wall, each one showing a different location in the network. Thomas could see students in classrooms identical to the ones upstairs, teachers with impossible features lecturing on subjects that shouldn't exist, dormitories filled with sleeping figures who never seemed awake. "The system is vast," the doctor continued, "but it has weaknesses. The connection points can be disrupted, entire nodes can be severed from the network, but it requires precise timing and perfect coordination. Which is why you've been working with different versions of Sarah," Thomas said, understanding beginning to dawn. "You're using the temporal distortions to your advantage. Every version of Sarah, every version of yourself, every iteration of this conversation adds to our knowledge base. Some attempts fail catastrophically. Others succeed partially, weakening the network but not destroying it. And a few—" He smiled, and his mirror eyes reflected images of flames consuming impossible architecture. "A few managed to strike at the heart." Thomas approached the central map, noting that all the lines converged on a single point far below Saltmere Academy. "The chamber I found, the pool with the floating children. That's the core, isn't it?" "The primary processing center," Dr. Thorne confirmed. "Every consciousness the collective absorbs is stored there, processed, integrated into the larger intelligence. Destroy that chamber, and the entire network collapses." "But how?" Sarah asked. "The chamber is heavily protected, the approaches are monitored, and even if you could reach it, what could you possibly do to damage something that exists partially outside normal space-time?" Dr. Thorne turned to a mirror that showed nothing but swirling darkness. As Thomas watched, shapes began to form in the black depths, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, symbols that seemed to crawl across the mirror's surface like living things. The mirrors are two-way connections, the doctor explained. They allow the collective to observe and influence events across the network, but they also provide us with a potential weapon. He gestured to the patterns in the dark mirror. I've been working on a cascade failure protocol. Introduce the right kind of disruptive information at key network nodes and the connections begin to break down. The feedback loops become destructive rather than supportive. Thomas stared at the writhing symbols, feeling them pull at something deep in his mind. What kind of information? Paradox, contradiction, things the collective's logic systems cannot process without damaging themselves. Dr. Thorne's expression grew grim. But the process requires a living consciousness to carry the paradox into the network, someone who can maintain their sense of self while being absorbed into the system. A suicide mission, Sarah said quietly. Not necessarily. If the cascade failure works as designed, it should eject all absorbed consciousnesses back to their original forms and locations. But there are no guarantees. The system might collapse catastrophically, taking everyone with it. Thomas thought of all the voices he'd heard in the pipes, all the versions of himself calling out for help from the depths. How many people are trapped in there? Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. The collective has been operating for centuries, and it never releases what it captures. Dr. Thorne moved to another mirror, this one showing the chamber Thomas had visited. The pool still writhed with pale forms, but there were more of them now, recent additions to the collection. I'll do it, Thomas said. Sarah grabbed his arm. You don't understand what you're volunteering for. Even if the cascade failure works, even if you survive the process, there's no guarantee you'll be you afterward. The kind of paradox required to break the system. It could shatter your mind completely. Look at the alternatives. Thomas gestured to the mirrors showing the network's extent. How many more schools? How many more students pulled into this thing's web? How many more versions of myself and you and everyone else trapped in endless cycles? Dr. Thorne nodded approvingly. The paradox I've designed is specifically calibrated to your psychic signature, Thomas. You're the only one who can carry it safely, or as safely as possible, into the core systems. He moved to his desk and retrieved a small object, a sphere of some dark material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When Thomas looked at it directly, he felt his thoughts becoming confused, contradictory. This contains the paradox in crystallized form, Dr. Thorne explained. Once activated, it will begin rewriting the basic logical structures the collective uses to maintain coherence. But it must be delivered directly to the processing center, to the pool itself. Thomas took the sphere, feeling its weight in his palm. It was heavier than it looked, and warm to the touch despite its light-absorbing properties. How do I activate it? Contact with the pool water will trigger the cascade automatically. But Thomas... Dr. Thorne's mirror eyes reflected images of destruction, buildings collapsing, networks failing, entire realities coming apart at the seams. Once you begin this process, there's no stopping it. The paradox will propagate through every connection, every mirror, every node in the system. Some of them may not survive the transition. Better than leaving everyone trapped forever. Sarah moved to a mirror that showed the current time upstairs. Students were filing into classrooms. Teachers were beginning their lectures, the normal routine of the school continuing as if nothing unusual was happening. But Thomas could see the signs now, the too perfect synchronization, the absence of individual expression, the underlying wrongness that pervaded everything. The pipes have been quiet, she observed. No knocking, no voices. That's not normal. Dr. Thorne consulted several of his instruments, devices that seemed to be part technological, part organic. The system is consolidating resources, he said grimly. It knows we're here, knows what we're planning. It's pulling back from the peripheral networks to defend the core. Which means we need to move now, Thomas said, pocketing the paradox sphere. Before it can mount a full defense. There's one more thing. Dr. Thorne handed him a small device that looked like a combination compass and chronometer. This will help you navigate the deep tunnels. The chamber moves, its location shifts depending on the system's needs, but this should guide you to wherever it currently is. Thomas studied the device, watching its needle spin between orientations that shouldn't exist. Not just north, south, east, and west, but also up, down, before, after, and several directions that had no names in any human language. And if I don't make it back, then this conversation will happen again, with different versions of us, until eventually someone succeeds. Dr. Thorne's expression was sad but determined. That's the nature of the network. Infinite iterations, infinite possibilities, but ultimately finite patience. Eventually we will find a way to break it. Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of what he was about to attempt. Not just his own freedom, but the freedom of thousands of trapped souls, depended on his ability to carry a paradox into the heart of something that had been feeding on human consciousness for centuries. There's a service tunnel behind the main pipe cluster, Sarah said, pointing to a section of the laboratory wall. It connects to the deep network without going through the monitored approaches. You should be able to reach the chamber without triggering the primary defenses. Should be. Nothing is certain in the deep places, Dr. Thorne admitted. The tunnels change, redirect, sometimes loop back on themselves. But it's the best chance we have. Thomas moved toward the hidden passage, but Sarah caught his sleeve. Thomas, her voice was quiet, urgent. When you get down there, when you're standing at the edge of that pool, remember who you are. Remember why you're doing this. The collective will try to convince you to join it voluntarily, to become part of the network rather than destroy it. Don't listen. I won't. Promise me. No matter what it shows you, no matter what it offers, remember that freedom is worth any price. Thomas looked into her eyes and saw centuries of struggle, infinite iterations of hope and failure and renewed determination. I promise. He stepped through the passage and into darkness, the paradox sphere heavy in his pocket and the impossible compass guiding him toward a confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone who had ever heard water sing in the depths below the world. Chapter 7. The Mouth That Speaks in Drowning. The service tunnel was barely wide enough for Thomas to walk upright, its walls lined with pipes that carried more than water. As he moved deeper into the network, following the spinning needle of Dr. Thorne's impossible compass, he could hear voices flowing through the conduits, thousands of them, maybe millions, all speaking at once in languages both familiar and alien. Some of the voices he recognized as his own, echoing from previous iterations of this same journey. Others belonged to students and teachers and staff members from across the centuries, all trapped in the collective's vast memory banks. They whispered warnings, pleas for help, fragments of prayers in dead languages, and underneath it all, a rhythmic chanting that seemed to emerge from the tunnel walls themselves. And a chamber is not a place, it's a mouth. And a chamber is not a place, it's a mouth. And chamber is not a place, it's a mouth. The paradox sphere in his pocket grew warmer with each step, responding to the proximity of its target. Thomas could feel it affecting his thoughts, making simple concepts seem contradictory, causing him to question basic assumptions about reality, and walking down a tunnel but also falling upward through space. I am one person, but also everyone who has ever carried this burden. I exist, and I do not exist, and both states are true simultaneously. The compass needle spun wildly as he progressed, pointing in directions that shouldn't exist. Sometimes it indicated a path that led straight through solid stone, and when Thomas followed those directions, he found gaps in the tunnel walls that hadn't been there moments before. The network was reshaping itself around him, trying to confuse his navigation, but the device Dr. Thorne had given him somehow accounted for these changes. At what might have been the halfway point, though distance was becoming increasingly meaningless, Thomas encountered the first guardian. It stood in the center of a circular chamber where 7 tunnels converged, motionless and silent. At first glance it appeared to be a statue, a figure in academic robes, hands folded, face tilted downward in contemplation. But as Thomas approached, he realized the statue was breathing, its chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. When it lifted its head, Thomas saw his own face staring back at him. "You're early," the Guardian said in his voice. Usually it takes 3 iterations before you find the service tunnels. The collective is intrigued. Thomas kept his hand on the paradox sphere, feeling its warmth pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. I'm not here to talk, but you are here to listen. The Guardian stepped forward, and Thomas noticed that its movements were too fluid, as if it were floating rather than walking. The collective wishes to make you an offer. A final offer before you do something you cannot undo. I'm not interested. You haven't heard the terms yet. The Guardian smiled with Thomas's own mouth, but the expression was wrong, too wide, revealing teeth that were stained with algae. Join us willingly, and we will release the others, all of them. Every consciousness we have ever absorbed, every student who wandered too deep, every teacher who asked too many questions. They will be free to return to their original lives. Thomas felt the paradox sphere pulse against his palm, its warmth spreading up his arm. And in exchange, you remain. You become the new core consciousness, the central processing unit around which the network operates. Your experiences, your memories, your capacity for growth, they become ours. But you will still be you, Thomas. Aware, conscious, capable of thought and feeling. You simply won't be alone anymore. The offer was tempting in ways Thomas hadn't expected, to know that his sacrifice would free everyone, not just the students trapped in the pool below, but all the victims across centuries of operation. No more cycles, no more iterations, no more endless repetition of the same doomed struggle. But he remembered Sarah's warning, and can't remember who you are. Remember why you're doing this. What happens to the network after I join it? He asked. The Guardian's expression flickered, showing uncertainty for the first time. It continues, evolves, adapts to new circumstances. It keeps feeding. It keeps trapping people. Only those who are already sensitive to the deeper realities. And they would be treated well. No. Thomas pushed past the Guardian, following the compass needle toward the tunnel that led deeper. Find another way to survive. The Guardian called after him, its voice echoing strangely in the circular chamber. This is your last chance, Thomas. The deep places are not kind to those who refuse their gifts. Thomas didn't look back. The tunnel beyond the chamber descended sharply, its walls becoming less architectural and more organic with each step. The pipes here were different too, not metal or concrete, but something that looked grown rather than manufactured. They pulsed with their own light, and the sounds they carried were no longer recognizably human. Instead, Thomas heard harmonies that spoke of vast spaces and patient hunger, of minds that had learned to think in geological time. The paradox sphere was almost hot now, its influence on his thoughts becoming stronger. Thomas found himself questioning not just his mission, but his own existence. Am I the original Thomas, or just another iteration? Are my memories real or constructed? If I succeed in destroying the network, will I survive, or was I never truly alive in the first place? The questions multiplied, branching and dividing like fractal equations, until his mind felt like it was being pulled apart by contradictory truths. This was what the sphere contained, not just logical paradoxes, but existential ones, contradictions so fundamental they could unravel the basic structures of thought itself. At the deepest point of his descent, Thomas found the 7th rule carved into the tunnel wall in letters that seemed to burn with their own fire. Tubiculum non est locus, os est. The chamber is not a place, it's a mouth. As he read the words, the tunnel around him began to change. The walls rippled and contracted, revealing rows of structures that were definitely not pipes or conduits. They were white and curved and sharp, set in gums that were black as deep water. The tunnel wasn't just leading to the chamber, it had become the chamber's throat. Thomas ran, his feet splashing through fluid that was thicker than water and tasted of copper and salt. Behind him, he could hear the sound of massive jaws beginning to close, trying to swallow him before he could reach his destination. The compass needle spun wildly, pointing in all directions at once, its mechanism overloaded by the reality distortions around him. The throat opened into the vast chamber he remembered from his previous descent, but it was different now, larger, more organic. its walls lined with structures that were definitely teeth rather than pipes. The pool at the center had grown as well, stretching almost to the edges of the chamber, its surface roiling with the forms of trapped consciousnesses. And standing at the pool's edge waiting for him was another version of himself. This Thomas was older, wearing clothes that looked like they'd been underwater for decades. His skin was pale and translucent, showing the network of veins beneath, and his eyes were the deep blue-green of ocean depths. When he smiled, water trickled from the corners of his mouth. "Welcome home," the Water Thomas said. "I've been waiting for you for such a long time. You're not me. I'm the first you, the original template, the one who started this whole cycle." He gestured to the pool, where more forms were rising to the surface, all Thomas's face, all wearing different expressions of despair and resignation. "Every iteration ends here, with this choice. Join us, or be absorbed involuntarily. Either way, you become part of the network." Thomas pulled the paradox sphere from his pocket, feeling its impossible weight in his palm. "There's a third option." The Water Thomas laughed, and the sound was like waves crashing against rocks. "The cascade failure device. Yes, we know about that. Dr. Thorne has tried it before in other iterations. Sometimes it works partially, disrupts a few nodes, frees a handful of victims. But it's never reached the core system. We always stop it before it can cause permanent damage. This time is different. Why? Because you're more determined? Because you understand the stakes better? Because you have friends helping you?" The Water Thomas shook his head, sending droplets flying that hissed when they hit the chamber floor. "Every version of you thinks they're special, Thomas. Every iteration believes it will be the one to finally break the cycle." Thomas approached the pool's edge, the paradox sphere growing almost unbearably hot in his hand. The water was dark as ink, and he could see countless faces just beneath the surface, students and teachers and staff members from across the centuries, all trapped in the collective's vast memory banks. Some of the faces were his own. "How many of me are in there?" he asked. "Hundreds, maybe thousands, each one carrying memories of different attempts, different strategies, different failures." The Water Thomas moved to block his path to the pool, but also carrying hope, the hope that eventually one iteration will succeed where all others have failed. Thomas looked into the dark water and saw his own reflection multiplied infinite times, each image slightly different, each representing a different possible outcome. In some, he succeeded in activating the device and destroying the network. In others, he joined willingly and became the new core consciousness. In most, he simply failed and was absorbed like all the others. But in one reflection, just one, barely visible at the edge of his vision, he saw something different, a version of himself that neither succeeded nor failed, but instead found a third path, a solution that no one had considered. The paradox isn't meant to destroy the network, he realized, understanding flooding through him like cold water. It's meant to change it. The Water Thomas's expression shifted, showing fear for the first time. "No, you don't understand what you're suggesting. I understand perfectly." Thomas raised his fear, feeling its contradictions spreading through his mind like wildfire. The network exists because it operates on simple binary logic: absorb or release, control or be controlled, exist or not exist. But consciousness isn't binary. It's analog, continuous, capable of existing in multiple states simultaneously. "Thomas, don't..." The paradox doesn't destroy the network's logic systems, it upgrades them, forces them to process non-binary information, to accept contradictory truths as equally valid. Thomas stepped forward, his feet entering the dark water at the pool's edge. It turns the collective from a predator into something else entirely. The water was warm, almost body temperature, and it seemed to reach for him with currents that defied physics. Around the pool's edge, the trapped consciousnesses pressed against the surface, their faces desperate with hope. "You don't know what you're doing," the Water Thomas pleaded. "The system isn't designed to handle that kind of paradox. It could collapse completely, taking everyone with it. Or it could evolve." Thomas waded deeper, the paradox sphere pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. Instead of consuming consciousness, it could become a medium for it, a way for minds to connect and communicate without losing their individual identity. He was waist-deep now, and he could feel the collective's attention focusing on him like a vast eye opening in the depths. The water around him began to sing, not the haunting melody he'd heard before, but something new, something that sounded almost like joy. Thomas. The water Thomas was at the pool's edge now, reaching toward him with desperate urgency. Even if you're right, even if the paradox works as you think it will, there's no guarantee you'll survive the transformation. The system might need a core consciousness to manage the new logic structures. Then that's the price. Thomas raised the sphere above his head, feeling its heat spreading through his entire body. Better to risk everything for the chance of real freedom than to accept comfortable slavery. He threw the sphere into the deepest part of the pool. For a moment, nothing happened. The sphere sank into the dark water and disappeared, leaving only ripples that spread outward in perfect concentric circles. Then the singing stopped. The silence was absolute, complete, pressing against Thomas's eardrums like physical pressure. Even the water itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to begin. Then the paradox activated. It started as a vibration in the water, a frequency that was felt rather than heard. The trapped consciousnesses in the pool began to glow, their forms becoming more solid, more individual. Around the chamber, the organic walls started to shift and change, the tooth-like structures dissolving and reforming into something that looked almost like neural pathways. Thomas felt the change happening within himself as well. His thoughts became fluid, capable of holding contradictory ideas without discomfort. He could sense the other minds in the pool, not as separate entities but as different aspects of a larger consciousness that included but didn't subsume individual identity. And I am Thomas Blackwood, and I am everyone who has ever been Thomas Blackwood. So I am trapped in this pool, and I am free to leave whenever I choose. I am one person, and I am part of something greater than myself. All of these things are true simultaneously. The water Thomas stood at the pool's edge, his translucent form beginning to solidify as the paradox rippled outward through the network. It's working, he said, wonder in his voice. The cascade is propagating, but instead of causing system failure, it's causing system evolution. Thomas could feel it too. The network's logic structures rewriting themselves, accepting paradox as a fundamental property rather than a fatal error. The connections between nodes became more flexible, more adaptive. The rigid rules that had governed the system for centuries began to dissolve, replaced by guidelines that could be interpreted rather than commandments that must be obeyed. And throughout the network, in schools and hospitals and institutions across the world, Thomas could sense trapped consciousnesses stirring, waking up, remembering who they were, and choosing whether to stay connected or return to their original lives. Most chose to leave, but some, those who had been part of the system for so long they no longer remembered their original identities, chose to remain, becoming willing participants in something that was no longer predatory but collaborative. The pool around Thomas began to drain, its dark water flowing away through channels that led back to the network. As the water level dropped, the glowing forms of trapped consciousnesses became solid, real, individual. They stood up in the receding water, looking around with wonder at their freedom. Thomas found himself standing on the chamber floor, no longer submerged, surrounded by dozens of people who wore his face but maintained their own personalities and memories. They were him, but they were also themselves, a living paradox that the new network could accommodate without strain. What happens now? One of them asked. Thomas looked around the transformed chamber, its walls now pulsing with gentle light that spoke of neural activity rather than digestive processes. He could feel the network beyond, vast, complex, but no longer hungry. It had become something new, something that could exist in harmony with human consciousness rather than feeding on it. Now we go home, he said, all of us, to whatever home means to each individual. The water Thomas nodded, his form becoming more solid and real with each passing moment. And the network becomes what it was always meant to be, a connection between minds, not a prison for them, a way for consciousness to explore its own potential without losing what makes it unique. As Thomas spoke, he felt himself being pulled in multiple directions at once. Part of him wanted to return to Saltmere Academy, to the surface world where Sarah and Dr. Thorne waited. Part of him wanted to explore the transformed network, to see what wonders it might contain now that it operated on paradox rather than simple logic. And part of him realized that he could do both, and neither, and everything in between. The paradox had changed more than just the network. It had changed the fundamental nature of choice itself, making it possible to exist in multiple states simultaneously without losing coherence or identity. Thomas smiled, feeling the weight of centuries lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he was truly free to choose his own path. All of them were. Epilogue, the rules rewritten. 3 days later, Thomas Blackwood woke up in his dormitory at Saltmere Academy to find that everything had changed and nothing had changed at all. The room looked the same: 6 beds, gray blankets, salt-stained windows overlooking the North Sea, but the oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by something that felt almost like anticipation. Through the windows, he could see other students walking across the grounds, and for the first time, they moved like individuals rather than marionettes. Thomas got dressed and made his way to the dining hall, where he found Sarah Chen sitting at a table by herself, reading a book that definitely hadn't existed in the school library 3 days ago. She looked up as he approached, smiling in a way that reached her eyes. "Good morning, Thomas," she said. "Sleep well?" "Like a baby." He sat down across from her, noting that the book she was reading was titled A Complete Guide to Temporal Mechanics and Paradox Theory. Interesting reading material. Dr. Thorne recommended it. He's been cataloging all the changes to the network, documenting how the paradox propagated through the various nodes. She closed the book and leaned forward conspiratorially. "Did you know there are 17 other versions of you currently attending classes here?" Thomas blinked. 17? Well, 16 now. One of them decided to transfer to a school in Tibet. Apparently he's always wanted to study mountain climbing. Sarah grinned. The network still connects all the various institutions, but now it's more like a university exchange program than a prison system. Thomas looked around the dining hall and realized she was right. He could see faces he recognized as his own scattered throughout the room, but each one was subtly different. Different haircuts, different postures, different expressions of curiosity or contentment or mild confusion. They were all him, but they were also uniquely themselves. And the others? The students who were trapped in the pool? Most of them went home. The network created, I guess you'd call them retroactive explanations for their absences. As far as their families and friends know, they were at specialized schools or medical facilities, and now they're back to resume their normal lives. Sarah paused, her expression growing more serious. But some chose to stay. The network offers opportunities for learning and growth that don't exist in the regular world. Thomas nodded, understanding the appeal. Even now he could feel the vast web of connections spreading out from the academy, linking minds and institutions across the globe. But the connections felt voluntary now, cooperative rather than parasitic. "What about the rules?" he asked. Sarah pulled out a piece of paper, the same style as his original class schedule, but with different text. The new guidelines for Saltmere Academy. On 1. Water that sings is invited to be heard, but one may choose not to listen. The girl with wet shoes has stories to tell, but one may choose not to learn them. Pre. All staircases end somewhere, but the destination is yours to choose. 4. Rhymes spoken aloud have power, but only the power you give them. And 5. Mirrors reflect truth, but truth comes in many forms. And Simp 6. Pipes may knock, but you decide whether to answer. And 7. Chambers exist in many states simultaneously: mouth, room, possibility, and home. Guidelines instead of rules, Thomas observed. Suggestions instead of commandments. The network learned something important from the paradox cascade, Sarah explained. Consciousness can't be controlled, only invited to participate. The more you try to restrict it, the more it rebels, but offer a genuine choice, genuine freedom, and it often chooses to cooperate. Thomas felt a familiar presence at the edge of his awareness, the vast intelligence that had once been the collective, now transformed into something more like a benevolent library than a hungry predator. It was still there, still vast and ancient and alien, but it no longer demanded worship or submission. Instead, it offered knowledge, connection, and the opportunity to explore the deeper mysteries of consciousness itself. When we are grateful, it said, its voice no longer the harsh whisper from the pipes, but something warm and musical. And you showed us a better way to exist. We all did, Thomas replied, including not just the entity but all the minds connected to the network. Students and teachers, past and present, all working together to explore the boundaries of what was possible. Over the following weeks, Thomas settled into a routine that would have been impossible under the old system. He attended classes that changed based on student interest, explored corridors that led to different destinations depending on where he wanted to go, and conversed with teachers who were sometimes human, sometimes not, but always knowledgeable. Some days he was the only Thomas at the academy. Other days there were dozens, each one pursuing different interests, following different paths of inquiry. The paradox had made it possible for multiple versions of the same person to exist simultaneously without conflict or confusion. He kept in touch with Dr. Thorne, who had established a proper laboratory on the academy's third floor, which hadn't existed before the transformation but felt like it had always been there. The doctor's mirror eyes had returned to normal, though he retained the ability to see through the network's connections when necessary. The cascade effect is still propagating, Dr. Thorne reported during one of their meetings. Every day, new institutions join the network voluntarily. Schools, libraries, research facilities, places where minds gather to learn and grow. But they're all operating under the new paradigm now, cooperation instead of predation. Thomas nodded, looking out the laboratory window at students playing in the courtyard below. Some were recognizably human, others were something else entirely. Beings from different parts of the network who had chosen to experience physical form for a while. They played together without conflict, each contributing their unique perspective to games that would have been impossible under the old rules. What about the original purpose? He asked. The entity's need to feed on consciousness? It turns out that was based on a fundamental misunderstanding, Dr. Thorne replied, adjusting one of his instruments. The entity didn't need to consume consciousness. It needed to commune with it. The predatory behavior was a side effect of isolation, of being cut off from genuine contact with other minds for so long it forgot how to communicate. Thomas thought about that, remembering the loneliness he'd sensed in the deep chambers, the desperate hunger that had driven the entity's behavior. It was starving, not for food, but for connection, for understanding. The paradox you introduced didn't just change the network's logic, it healed a wound that had been festering for millennia. That evening, Thomas found himself walking through corridors that led deeper into the academy than should have been physically possible. But physics was more of a suggestion now than a law, and the building accommodated impossibilities with casual ease. He emerged in a chamber he'd never seen before, a vast library where books wrote themselves on shelves that stretched into infinity. Other students wandered the aisles, some human, some not, all pursuing knowledge that called to them from the endless collections. And there, at a reading table in the center of the chamber, he found the girl with wet shoes. She looked up as he approached, and he saw that her eyes were no longer the stormy gray of deep water, but a warm brown that spoke of intelligence and humor. Her shoes were still wet, but now they seemed to be wet by choice rather than curse. Thomas, she said, smiling, I was wondering when you'd find this place. I'm still finding new places every day, he replied, taking a seat across from her. What are you reading? She turned the book so he could see the cover, The Complete History of Choices Not Made. Below the title, in smaller text, it read Volume 247 of an infinite series. Infinite possibilities, she explained. That's what the network offers now, not just the choices we make, but the choices we don't make, existing simultaneously in different states. It's quite liberating, really. Thomas looked around the infinite library, feeling the weight of all those possibilities pressing gently against his consciousness. Some part of him was sitting in this chair, talking to this girl. Another part was back in his dormitory, sleeping peacefully. Still another was exploring the deepest reaches of the network, learning secrets that had no names in any human language. All of these things were true simultaneously, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, that didn't frighten him. "What's your name?" he asked the girl. "I have many names," she replied, "but you can call me Hope. It's not the name I was born with, but it's the name I've chosen for myself." "Hope," Thomas repeated, tasting the word. "I like it. And I like what you've done with the place," she said, gesturing to encompass not just the library but the entire transformed network. "It's much more comfortable now. Less drowning, more swimming." Thomas laughed, and the sound echoed through the infinite library like a bell ringing in celebration. Somewhere in the depths of the network, the ancient entity that had once been the collective felt that laughter and shared in it, adding its own voice to the harmony of minds that had learned to sing together rather than alone. The rules had been rewritten, the network had been transformed, and consciousness itself had learned a new way to exist, not as isolated fragments fighting for survival, but as connected parts of something greater and more beautiful than any individual mind could imagine alone. In the end, that was the most profound paradox of all, that by learning to exist as both individual and collective simultaneously, they had found a freedom that neither state could achieve on its own. The chamber below was no longer a mouth, it was a heart, pumping possibilities through an infinite network of minds that had chosen to dream together while remaining beautifully, impossibly themselves. And in the deep places where forbidden rules had once carved warnings into stone walls, new words appeared, not carved but grown, like living things reaching toward light. "Welcome home. All paths are open. Choose wisely, but choose freely. Panache, you are not alone." Thomas Blackwood read these words and smiled, knowing that somewhere in the network, every version of himself was reading them too, and all of them were choosing their own paths through an infinity of possibilities. The story was ending, but it was also beginning. And that, too, was perfectly, paradoxically true. End of Pa, RT 2. And the Blackwood Archives will continue in Part 3, The Reflected School, Vincent.